Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. And it's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Hello everyone. Oh my goodness, camera angle not so great. I have been, there we go. The way the studio is currently set up, every time I turn the camera on, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. All right. So, let's get started. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking in, saying hello, and watching the news with us. It was a slow news week. Was being the operative word. Until this weekend happened. And oh my goodness. Please pardon my being a little bit tardy today. I just got back from running a bunch of errands, and I've been all over town, and it's been a lot today. So thank you for bearing with me on that. You can tell I'm a little tired, but it's okay. We're gonna have a lot of fun. There's some great stuff happening on the Cameron Journal. We have a new interview today. I've also been, those who follow my social media closely, I've also been slowly uploading some old episodes from my old talk show, the Cameron Cowan Show, from back in 2014-2015 days. So if you're following me on social media, you'll get notifications for those coming across as I finish renaming them and publishing them and all this type of thing. So it's a lot, but we're doing good stuff. So that's we're kind of in between everything on the Cameron Journal front. There's been a couple good articles that have come out lately, including one that's very germane to today's news, on Samuel Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, you should definitely do so. We have some great stuff coming out in July. One of my really great contributors, Sophia Young, sent me a bunch of content that I got all posted up. So that's exciting. So there's some great stuff coming in July. I have been talking about it a little bit, not so much on here, but I'm working on developing a new line of business doing writing coaching for people, and I was very excited because today I got my July-August edition of Poets and Writers, and I found my classified ad for writing coaching in the back. So that's super exciting. Went nationwide, and into everybody's, anybody who subscribes to that magazine got it, as well as on newsstand, all this type of thing. So that was really great. And shout out to Poets and Writers. If you're interested in writing and content and you're not a subscriber to Poets and Writers, you need to be. Don't let the title Poets throw you off. They do a lot more than poetry. They are an excellent go-to resource for literary journals. If you need help with your book submissions, services, inspiration to write, prompts, learning about the industry, all this type of thing. And the best thing is they're actually nonprofit. So, and one of the really great things they do for advertising is they have discounts for Indigenous and people of color, which definitely saved me a little bit of money, which I appreciated. And they fundraise all year long. They work super hard to put this whole magazine together. They're a genuinely great organization. So if you're literarily minded, Poets and Writers is a great publication. Writer.com is also great, but it's not quite my favorite. Writer's Digest is all right. They've kind of fallen off in the last couple years, but Writer's Digest is also really is a helpful resource as well. So if you're starting to write and want to start to see yourself published and put yourself out there, need some help self-publishing, all this type of thing, that's definitely most essential. And if you're looking for some writing coaching, developmental editing, all this type of thing, then please keep me in mind. I am working this week on my new writing course called The Power of Story, both fiction and nonfiction. So that stuff will be coming online here soon, and we'll be talking more about that as time goes on. So that's it on the personal front. It's like I said, it's been a bit slow around here, just getting everything together. It's the end of June. I cannot believe we are more than halfway through 2023. It's nuts. I never, it seems like it was New Year's yesterday, and I just can't believe that we're already here, and it's already 2023. So I'm definitely still kind of reeling from all of that, and still trying to get my mind around we're in the back half of the year, and so it's a lot. It's a lot right now. But let's leave all that behind. Let's get into the news. And I'm going to start with news that's still somewhat breaking and maybe somewhat out of date by the time, if you are not watching right now. The news that may be somewhat out of date if you're listening to this later. I'm recording this at 5 o'clock p.m. on Monday, June the 26th, 2023, Pacific Daylight Time in Seattle, Washington. And this is current according to the New York Times at the time of now. If you're listening to this even tomorrow, the 27th, this may have changed, but for right now, the 26th, this is the latest. And it says here, a visibly angry Vladimir Putin on Monday denounced as blackmail a weekend rebellion by the Wagner group, mercenary group, even as he defended his response to the mutiny and hinted at leniency for those who took part, saying that, quote, the entire Russian society united, quote, around his government. Speaking publicly for the first time in 2 days, Mr. Putin, in an address on broadcast on Monday night, refused to utter the name of the Wagner boss behind the insurrection, Yevgeny Prigozhin. But his contempt was clear for those who had seemed, briefly, to threaten civil war and upend Russia's war effort in Ukraine, where Ukrainian forces are mounting a counteroffensive. Quote, they wanted Russians to fight each other, said Mr. Putin, Russia's president. They rubbed their hands, dreaming of taking revenge for their failures at the front and during the so-called counteroffensive. Throughout the day, the Kremlin had sought to project an air of normalcy, unity, and stability, despite Mr. Putin's absence from public view after perhaps the most serious crisis of his two-decade rule. When he finally emerged, the Russian leader skirted a host of unanswered questions left by the revolt. Instead, at the core of his 5-minute speech on Monday was his insistence that he leads a nation and a government that present a united front to all threats. Quote, civic solidarity has shown that any blackmail attempts to create internal unrest are doomed to failure. The agreement that abruptly ended mutiny on Saturday, with Wagner forces claiming they'd reached 125 miles outside of Moscow, called for Mr. Prigozhin to go into exile in Belarus rather than face punishment, according to the Kremlin spokesman. Mr. Putin suggested that the Wagner fighters who do not want to sign up with the regular Russian military may go there too. After his address, he was shown on television convening a meeting with his defense and interior ministers, prosecutor general, and chiefs of the security services and National Guard to discuss how to respond to the episode. Mr. Prigozhin, until recently a vital ally of Mr. Putin, said in an 11-minute stream of consciousness voice memo posted on the messaging app Telegram on Monday that the government was trying to destroy Wagner, which he said would effectively have to disband by this coming Saturday. And then it goes on to his comments. So, for those who don't know and haven't heard, Friday night in the U.S., I'm a little parched today. There was a sudden surge of Wagner Group mercenary fighters that left the front lines in Ukraine and started marching back through Russia towards Moscow with an eye, an air, and an idea that that they were, I guess, going to start a civil war or take over the government or seize power or whatever have you. Again, according to them, they got within 125 miles of Moscow, closer than the French or the Germans, but got very close to Moscow, and there was kind of this brief moment kind of over the weekend where it looked like Prigozhin might try to seize power. This was not a populist revolt by any stretch of the imagination. This was a mercenary group taking matters into their own hands, and then seemingly without any change, kind of late Saturday into Sunday, all of a sudden the coup was over. It was a pretty shocking about face, as coup attempts go, to go from the we're on the march and we're gonna get him to, oh yeah, never mind. And I have another news story where Prigozhin says that he, quote, was not trying to overthrow Putin. And he said, we want to demonstrate our protest not to overthrow the government in the country, according to his 11-minute voice message on Telegram. Mr. Prigozhin said the protest was aimed at a move by the Ministry of Defense to force his mercenaries to sign contracts with the government, which he said would have effectively halted Wagner's activities in Ukraine as of July 1st. The fighters, Mr. Prigozhin said, were planning to give up their heavy weapons to the Russian army until they were attacked from behind on Friday night, killing at least 30 Wagner soldiers, a claim for which there's been no independent evidence. And as people pointed out, like, this is the first time in 23 years that there has been any open armed rebellion against Putin, and it kind of sent the whole Russian government scrambling. I was listening to a little bit of Morning Joe in the car today, and David Ignatius pointed out that as an autocrat, this type of thing is very dangerous because it kind of shows the chink in the armor. In so much as, you know, to be a good autocrat, you have to have absolute control over all things, all people and systems and all this type of thing. And so to have any sort of rebellion, especially at this level during a war that you started, and have the rebellion be by someone who has come out against the war you started, calling it a war of choice and unnecessary and not going well, is not a good thing as an autocrat. It leaves, and it's not clear why Lukashenko and Belarus offered to like solve this problem for Putin. We don't know where Prigozhin is right now. There's a lot we still kind of don't know about this, and we don't necessarily know or understand why there was a coup and then all of a sudden no coup. The whole situation is just bizarre. It's just bizarre. And although I will say in the history of Russia, this is not the first time a general in the field has been in open rebellion against leadership in Moscow. Not by far. So it's kind of funny to kind of see Russia reprise this this idea, but that's it's a very difficult thing. Instability. The one thing we do know: the situation is now is getting increasingly unstable. This has a lot of implications for both regional stability within Russia, and potentially stability regarding nuclear weapons and the command and control and what will happen with all of that. This is probably the most danger that we've faced regarding lack of control of nuclear weapons since the fall of the Soviet Union 30 years ago now. And that is definitely a concern. I don't know if it's still this way, but at one time, there was a plan in the event of unplanned regime change in Russia to send in special forces to seize Russia's nuclear weapons. Now, I don't know if that plan is still on the books, if the Pentagon still would do that, or what would happen, but keep your powder dry on this one. It's a very, very fluid situation. And most cheerfully, it shoved that stupid Titanic submersible story right off the front headlines. Because that was last week's big story. Oh, the poor submersible, it imploded and killed everyone on board. Well, they were running it with an Xbox controller and they were stupid for being down there in a DIY sub. So, but this is much more important. This is, this could kill us all. The submersible situation, not so much. But this whole situation is not so good, and could definitely have much wider implications than any of us, I think, really realize. And I think it's all very difficult, and as I said, it's a very fluid situation. It, like I said at the beginning, will probably change by the time you hear this, if you're listening to it later. And I think that's I think the most dangerous part is we just don't know what's gonna come of all this quite yet. So let's move on to a couple other stories that we have going. One of them I did save off, actually, ironically, is the Titan submersible problem. It says here that the Titan submersible disaster probes face tricky test of criminal liability. Fault could fall on Titan's other employees or inspectors. U.S. Canada could pursue charges based on jurisdiction. It says here that U.S. and Canadian officials are looking into what went wrong in a commercial deep-sea adventure and whether crimes were committed that led to the Titan submersible to implode and kill all 5 people on board. The probes into the Titan disaster, which occurred in international waters on June 18th, may be complicated by questions of which country should take the lead. And doubts that the 22-foot watercraft fits the legal definition of a maritime vessel. With the death of the chief executive officer of the submersible company who was on board, potential criminal liability could fall on OceanGate's other employees, operations managers, or inspectors. The U.S. Coast Guard announced it will pursue its highest level of investigation after a search and rescue mission turned up debris of the submersible on the ocean floor near the Titanic wreck in the North Atlantic. The probe will examine accountability aspects of the implosion, Coast Guard Captain Jason Neubauer said at a Sunday press conference in Boston, adding that it may result in, quote, recommendations to the proper authorities to pursue civil or criminal sanctions as necessary. Canada's Transportation Safety Board launched its own inquiry as pieces of the submersible owned and operated by a U.S.-based OceanGate continue to be collected in the port of St. John's, Newfoundland. If I was representing anybody that has anything to do with this thing, and they were U.S. citizens or based in the U.S., I would be jumping up and down saying, you need to lawyer up immediately and get a real good analysis of what the potential liability could be, said George Chalos, a maritime defense lawyer. So, the poor little sub sank and imploded at 13,000 feet. It happens pretty fast, and when that type of thing happens, it usually happens so quickly, those on board will have barely known it occurred. So I guess the only solace now is that anybody involved didn't feel any pain. They didn't suffer. They weren't, because initially we thought they were going to be stuck down there for days and days and we're running out of air and all this type of thing. Unfortunately, they didn't suffocate. They just, that was it. Boom and suck, and that was the end of that. So that was the big news story from last week, and that kind of what was taking up everything. And then, the almost coup, not a coup in Russia, just moved that right off. Now, back here in the United States, this week we are anticipating a ton of Supreme Court case decisions. So if you're wondering why all the bad news from the Supreme Court seems to come in June, there's a reason for that. The Supreme Court ends its term. They actually have terms where they do oral arguments and then have a decision period to write their briefs and dissents and all this type of thing, and then they announce their decision. The term for that whole process ends every June, and so throughout June, as the briefs are finished and the dissents and all of that stuff are written, that's why everything kind of comes out in June. And it's been 1 year since we lost Roe v. Wade, and another chink in the whole idea of a right to privacy. This week we're anticipating a new raft of decisions, so I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about that next week on the NewsHour. But the big one that we're anticipating this week is the Supreme Court decision on President Biden's student loan relief program. Says here, according to Bloomberg, advocates of student debt relief want President Joe Biden to use a 1965 law to cancel student debt if the Supreme Court overturns his loan forgiveness program. Biden's current plan to forgive as much as $20,000 in federal loans for certain borrowers making less than $125,000 per year, or $250,000 for households, is based on his authority in the 2003 HEROES Act. A Supreme Court ruling invalidating the loan forgiveness program looks likely as the court issues some of its most momentous decisions this week. Astra Taylor, a co-founder of the Debt Collective, a 50,000-member group, points to provisions in the Higher Education Act from almost 6 decades ago that Biden could use to forgive student debt. But this alternative strategy advocates are coalescing around would be time-consuming and could easily delay any relief until after the 2024 election. Jed Sugarman, a law professor at Fordham University, said, "The Higher Education Act requires a lengthy rulemaking process that could take about a year, and then after that, litigation by opponents would likely drag things out longer." The Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which claims 1 million members, has a mobilization campaign ready to bombard the White House with emails and phone calls demanding Biden pursue an alternative path if the court overturns his student loan forgiveness program. The NAACP and allied groups have made preparations for a rally within 2 hours of a negative decision. "It's up to President Biden to live up to the promises he made to America, particularly to Black Americans," said Wisdom Cole, director of the NAACP's Youth and College Division. "Failure isn't an option." Political stakes are high. The loan relief plan was one of the president's signature initiatives and disproportionately benefits younger adults and minorities, both crucial Democratic constituencies that can be difficult to turn out for elections. Overall, 53% of American adults support Biden's loan relief program, according to a February Economist YouGov poll, but an overwhelming 67% of 18 to 29-year-olds back it, and an even larger 72% of African Americans of all ages do. Black borrowers are much likely to carry higher balances on their student loan debt than other demographic groups. Almost 6 out of 10 black borrowers have at least $25,000 in student loan debt, according to the Federal Reserve. Delivering student loan relief will be extremely important to motivating young minority voters for Biden's re-election, said Adam Green, co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign. So, be a lookout for that one, because that is going to be coming down this week. I agree with the news story. I think it's likely that they're not going to let it go through, and they're going to say, no, you can't do that, and that's going to kind of return it back to an active discussion in the political environment, and it's going to be something that I think Biden's going to want some movement on before 2024. If he continues to run, which we're going to get to that in a minute. However, before we get to that, I want to stop and talk about U.S. and China stuff. So this story is really interesting. Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, plans a July trip to China while they're working on a U.S. investment curbing regulation. So, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen plans to visit Beijing in early July for the first high-level economic talks with their new Chinese counterpart, people familiar with the scheduling said. This is from Bloomberg. Her trip was long anticipated but was put off until the appropriate time, Yellen said in April. The people discussed the timing and purpose of the trip on a condition of anonymity because the details haven't been officially announced. In addition, the Biden administration executive order that would regulate and potentially cut off certain U.S. investments in China is nearing completion, and officials are aiming to have it ready as soon as late July, people familiar with internal deliberations said. The Treasury chief would be the second U.S. cabinet official to travel to Beijing after relations between the world's two biggest economies soured earlier this year. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken just wrapped up his trip to China, where he met with his counterpart and also had a short audience with Chinese President Xi Jinping. U.S. and Chinese officials described the Blinken visit as productive and said the two sides had candid conversations on a range of issues. An administration official said Monday that Yellen's travel to China isn't confirmed yet, while the executive order hasn't been finalized and doesn't yet have a timeline for issuance. I think it's interesting that they're doing these things both at the same time. I could see the timing of it being that Yellen will go to China before it happens, and then I imagine there's multiple drafts of this order. How severe the curbs are and how far the executive order goes will probably be somewhat dependent on how the trip to China with Yellen goes. If the trip is productive and they get some stuff done, maybe it won't be so bad. If the trip is not productive and not a lot gets talked about or done, then it could be more severe. So I imagine it's kind of being used as kind of both a bit of a stick and carrot situation. So this will be her first meeting with her Chinese counterpart, who's actually a bit new to the job, and they're also still working on, after Blinken and Yellen, they're still working on a grand conversation between Xi Jinping and President Biden. So that could be interesting. While we're on the subject of President Biden, here's an interesting one that I just kind of passed by and was kind of like, oh, this is odd. Headline, who's visiting the White House? The logs include 300,000 names and are still incomplete. And why is this story not coming up? Good question. So President Joe Biden promised greater transparency about who is visiting the White House. Now I don't need to do all that. Um, the story is not coming up, but I'll tell you about it. So there's a question, I guess, as to why President Biden has chosen to or to not reopen the White House visitors logs and reveal who has been visiting him. JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon, Senator Manchin are among a list of more than 300,000 visitors, but the records don't appear complete, which I thought was interesting. And so I thought that was again, this isn't a thing, it isn't a story, there's nothing to like talk about with it, not really, but I thought it was interesting that that this was kind of becoming a whole thing. So I thought that was fun. And I a lot of things when it comes to records and all this type of thing, everybody gets all, kind of weirded out by things and are like, oh, well, we don't have this record and that record, and oftentimes it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't really affect anyone. But I think it's I think it's interesting as a exercise that this is, something that somebody would care about, especially at this stage of Biden's presidency. Although I think it does, for some people, kind of raise the question, well, who are you seeing? Who are you talking to? I think it raises that question as well. So that's an interesting sort of thing. And also, when it comes to like the whole transparency of it all, there's a lot of people who kind of wonder if he promised more transparency, and when you promise transparency and then you have this appearance of not transparency, then people wonder, what are you hiding? And I think that's the biggest problem with this whole conversation, is we're always, if we're always wondering, well, what are you hiding? What is the story? All this type of thing. So I think that's, a difficult thing, but I don't think it's going to be any more of a story than this. And if anything, this isn't that uncommon, especially given, given what other presidents have done, like Trump, and all this type of thing. So, but I just thought it was interesting that it was getting brought up, because usually, sometimes with a lot of these stories, okay, so with a lot of these stories, sometimes I look at it and I'm kind of like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, and that could be a thing, and all this type of thing. Other times, I view it as, the beginning of something that, I view it as it could be the beginning of something, or a new narrative, or a new aspect of a story that we haven't thought about before. And that one, I think, is interesting to keep an eye on. I don't think it's a story, I don't think it's going to matter long term, but I think it's something worth keeping an eye on. Now, a story that is definitely becoming a thing, and is something to keep a close eye on, because it's going to affect the whole economy, is commercial real estate. So in this story, we have from Bloomberg Business Week. The extend and pretend real estate strategy is running out of time. High interest rates and soaring vacancies have brought the commercial property industry to the brink. It says here, the high chieftains of real estate finance flocked to the Marriott Marquis in New York's Times Square in June at a precarious moment for their business. commercial property transactions were stalled, squelching demand for new loans. And loans made during the mid-pandemic go-go days, when the world was high on government stimulus money, needed fixing. Yet many conference goers were upbeat, trading notes on a surprisingly resilient economy and the media's tendency to exaggerate the challenges. An after-party at Cipriani was, quote, an absolute zoo, says Toby Cobb, a managing partner and lender at 3650 REIT, as if the industry were operating at peaks last seen in 2006. It's not that the market participants had forgotten the lessons of the global financial crisis that followed the 2000s boom, it's that they remembered them. Faced with delinquent loan payments, lenders decided to be patient. Instead of foreclosing on properties whose value was plummeting, they lengthened loan terms and ignored short-term valuations. They called it extend and pretend, and it worked so well that when COVID-19 brought the global economy to a halt in March of 2020, they turned to it again. A rolling loan, they said, gathers no loss. Yet, in some quarters, there are growing fears that the strategy might not work this time. It won't. The rapid increase in interest rates over the past year sucked the air out of inflated valuations. As a result, landlords need to come up with more cash to offset the lower building value when they refinance their debt. At the same time, banks and insurers are under scrutiny from regulators and ratings companies over their real estate lending, and the pandemic accelerated changes to how people use offices, with uncertain implications for everything from downtown lunch spots to the tax revenues of major cities. Quote, the demand for commercial real estate debt is as big as I've seen in my career, but the supply is also more constrained than I've ever seen it, said Warren DeHaan, a managing partner at Awry Capital, a commercial real estate lender with $20 billion under management. Landlords may be able to get loans, but at painful rates. The problem is so big that there's going to be a decent subset of loans that can't be extended. There's about $20 trillion worth of commercial property in the U.S., including offices, rental housing, warehouses, and retail spaces. According to Keefe, Brigette, and Woods, the crisis will affect each category differently. Lower quality office buildings are headed the way of the lower quality shopping mall. They're virtually unfinanceable and will likely remain that way until foreclosed properties are brought back to market at drastically lower prices. Other property types are still in better shape, though owners who bought during the frothiest days of 2021 are in for a reckoning. Commercial real estate values could fall 30% or more from peak to trough. This compares to a similar decline in the early 1990s following the savings and loan crisis, as well as a 40% decrease after the global financial crisis. Falling values are only part of the problem. About $1.3 trillion worth of commercial real estate loans will come due by the end of 2025, according to MSCI Real Assets. Most borrowers will need new loans to pay off their old ones, and lenders are being much more careful than they were a few years ago. In the worst-case scenario, borrowers can't refinance, banks report losses, and in a repeat of what happened at Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic in the spring, nervous depositors start pulling their money out, sending banks to the edge. I have said since 2021 that we have a problem in commercial real estate. And I was right. And I saw with this whole work from home thing and people being on hybrid and companies are just going to need less space. We have a lot of office space in this country, too much, really. We've had way too much retail space for decades. And the reckoning of all of this is coming to a head. The problem, really, is a lot of pension funds rely on commercial real estate. A lot of retirement plans rely on commercial real estate. A lot, because it's more stable than rental housing. Like, there's a lot of capital invested in real estate because it generates a return. And a pretty easy, straightforward return that's not cyclical like the stock market. Or a mutual fund or an ETF or anything like that. And so, as well, the reliable money coming in is a big part of, these companies, for their pension plans and all this type of thing. And especially government pension plans. And so to have a crisis in commercial real estate has huge effects on anything that owns those assets that was looking for that return. So it's not just a developers needing new loans to finance their properties problem. It's also a lot of that debt's going to become toxic problem. And yes, banks will be affected. And yes, there's, funds that are not going to get a return that they were hoping on from their commercial real estate assets. And that is a huge problem. And with the $1.3 trillion debt bomb coming in 2025, if even a fraction of that can't get refinanced, 10% is $100 billion. That's a lot of money. If it is higher, like 20 or 30 or 40%, that's a recession-inducing event. So keep an eye on commercial real estate. Obviously, I'll be talking about it more here on the NewsHour, but yeah, that chicken's about to come home to roost, and I'm not looking forward to the eggs. In another knock-on effect from the pandemic, this story is quite sad from the New York Times. It says here, the math and reading performance of 13-year-olds in the United States has hit its lowest level in decades, according to test scores released today from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the gold standard federal exam. The last time math performance was this low for 13-year-olds was in 1990, in reading in 2004. Performance that has fallen significantly since the 2019-2020 school year, when the coronavirus pandemic wrought havoc on the nation's education system. But the downward trends reported today began years before the health crisis, raising questions about a decade of disappointing results for American students. The federal standardized test, known as NAEP, was given last fall and focused on basic skills. The 13-year-old scored an average of 256 out of 500 in reading and 271 out of 500 in math, down from average scores of 260 in reading and 280 in math 3 years ago. Achievement declined across lines of race, class, and geography, but in math, especially vulnerable children, including Black, Native American, and low-income students, experienced bigger drops. A large body of research shows that most American children experienced academic struggles during the pandemic. It has also been clear that low-income students of color were most heavily affected by school closures and remote learning, which in some districts lasted more than a year. The latest NAEP results are the federal government's final major release of data on pandemic learning loss. The scores add to educators' understanding of the challenges that lie ahead for children of different ages and demographic groups. The 13-year-olds who took this version of the NAEP exam last fall were 10 years old and in 4th or 5th grade when the pandemic began. Many were old enough to participate in remote learning without minute-to-minute adult assistance, as younger children often needed. But the ages of 10 to 13 are also a crucial period for mastering foundational skills, from multiplication to recognizing a character's feelings in a short narrative passage. The bottom line, these results show that there are troubling gaps in the basic skills of these students, said Peggy Carr, Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, which gives the NAEP exam. This is a huge-scale challenge that faces the nation. We're going to close with talking about RFK, but I think the biggest cost of the pandemic lockdown was what it did to a whole generation of children's education. Not only do we now know that lockdowns were unnecessary and didn't work, but we have now, we've lost 30 years of progress in education. Decades of hard-won, hard-fought improvement in reading and math are gone. And it will take as many years, if not more, to get it back. There's a generation of kids that will be forever hobbled by what happened during the pandemic. Their skills will never be as good as their peers that came right before, or those that came right after. It's a tragedy. It's a real tragedy. It's very, when you consider this sort of thing, it is not a surprise why parents are angry, teachers are angry, other people are angry, all this type of thing. It's no shock as to why that is. Because, unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that these lockdowns had a profound adverse effect on the nation's children. And that is something that we just simply can't ignore. It's real, it's here, it's been verified, we have lost progress, and it's going to take a lot of years to get it back. The children of those affected by lockdown will be the ones that will reap the rewards of the work we have to put in. I think it's going to be a struggle for teachers all the way through, for the kids through the pandemic, for the rest of their school careers, which will be another 5 to 8 years, depending on when you started, even up to 10 if you go younger. Teachers are going to be fighting this for the rest of their time. You're probably going to see a spike in the dropout rate later on in high school. You're probably going to see other sort of knock-on social effects. You might even see a spike in teen pregnancy. It's going to be a difficult situation ahead for the education system. And unfortunately, I don't know that there's anything that we can do about it quite at this juncture. That is gonna make a meaningful move forward for these kids. So the last story I want to talk about is the rise of RFK Jr. and who he's been talking to, and all this type of thing. And this is from Vanity Fair, which says, of course, the right has welcomed RFK Jr. with open arms. Roger Stone has said the quiet part out loud. The conspiracy peddling Kennedy running in the Democratic primary could do damage to Joe Biden and boost Donald Trump's chances. It says here, why did I spend the entire weekend reading about the dumbest member of the Kennedy family? Likely because Donald Trump's death grip on the Republican Party is as strong as ever, and indictments be damned. Like it or not, and most of us do not, Trump still leads his closest competitor, Ron DeSantis, by at least 30 points in the 3 national polls conducted most or entirely after the news of the federal indictment broke. Republicans appear stuck. Trump is increasingly looking like the eventual GOP presidential nominee, yet 56% of Americans think Trump should drop out of the 2024 presidential. You can almost smell the panic. Enter the spoiler candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Joe Biden's long-shot Democrat primary challenger, who's recently been getting some high-profile support from figures associated with the right. Elon Musk hosted a Twitter space for the raging anti-vaxxer, who not too long had to apologize for suggesting the plight of the unvaccinated in America was worse than that of Anne Frank. After Peter Hotez, a pediatrician and vaccine expert, tweeted critically about a Joe Rogan interview with Kennedy, both Musk and Rogan defended RFK Jr., taking aim at Hotez by suggesting he debate Kennedy's claims on Rogan's show. Wealthy Republican and DeSantis supporter David Sachs hosted a fundraiser for the guy. Former Twitter CEO and facial hair enthusiast Jack Dorsey endorsed him too. Dorsey has a habit of embracing the unelectable candidates. In 2019, he donated to both Andrew Yang and Fox News favorite Tulsi Gabbard. Steve Bannon is apparently a huge RFK Jr. supporter, floating Kennedy, quote, as an excellent choice for President Trump to consider as a running mate. Roger Stone called the Trump-Kennedy ticket a dream. InfoWars' Alex Jones was struck by Kennedy's anti-vaccine conspiracies and told listeners he was definitely awake. Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk and QAnon-linked Michael Flynn both said they liked the guy as a presidential candidate too. So why are all these right-wingers supporting a Democrat? It could be that he kind of sounds like them. He talks about government institutions betraying the trust of the American public and published a whole book attacking Anthony Fauci. But there's also very likely another reason. It seems important to mention here that Kennedy, to put it mildly, is a crank. As conservative Noah Rothman wrote in the National Review, quote, Kennedy has promoted the view that the COVID vaccines were concocted only to enrich the medical establishment, that 5G cell towers are designed to control our behavior, and that Microsoft founder Bill Gates is engaged in an effort to genetically modify humanity. He's blamed mass shootings on antidepressants and told Musk and Sachs that his position on gun control is, I'm not going to take away anybody's guns. He believes Russia's war against Ukraine is a setup by the neocons and the CIA, and he wants to seal the border permanently, and went on Jordan Peterson's podcast to suggest that he believes that kids are trans because they are, quote, swimming through a soup of toxic chemicals. I don't know any mainstream Democrats who believe anything resembling this melange of conspiracy theories. If you're wondering what his family thinks about him, in 2019 his siblings and nephews wrote in Political magazine, quote, we love Bobby, he's one of the great champions of the environment. We stand behind him in his ongoing fight to protect our environment. However, on vaccines, he is wrong. For years, RFK Jr. has lurked in the shadows as the anti-vaxxer Kennedy. Now his politics not only have a base among the MAGA right, he's proving politically expedient for Republicans as well. It's a peculiar logic. Shouldn't having right-wing support indicate he's in fact a right-winger, not that the right wing is the true Democratic Party? His campaign manager, former Ohio Representative Dennis Kucinich, goes on to explain that the fringe support as a feature, not a bug. If he can win all the people on the margins, both on the left and the right of the political spectrum, maybe he can scrape something together. Kucinich suggests, maybe not, but perhaps as Republicans appear to be hoping that he can at least spoil the race for Biden. His candidacy in the Democratic Party has already been declared a headache for Biden. RFK Jr. has had surprisingly decent polling numbers, as high as 20%, perhaps showing Biden's deficiencies. After all, around the same time Biden was preparing to announce his re-election bid, a poll showed that only half of Democrats want him to run again. No wonder Trump's allies are chatting up RFK Jr. As the Times' Reed Epstein wrote, quote, he serves as a bracing reminder of left-leaning voters' healthy appetite for a Biden alternative, and is a glaring symbol of the president's weaknesses. Stone said it himself in an interview that RFK Jr., quote, will help in the end soften Joe Biden up for his defeat by Donald Trump in the general election. I talked to Hotez about his dust-up with Rogan, Musk, and Bannon over RFK Jr. I'm just collateral damage, he said in my podcast, Fast Politics, about the political game right-wingers are playing around the Democratic candidate. It doesn't surprise me. Republicans are worried. They know that the indictments don't help grow the electorate. They know that as the chasm between the mainstream and the primary voters grows, so do the chances of a Biden re-election. There are a few options left to help pump up their guy. RFK Jr. is one. That's from Molly Jong Fast, writing for Vanity Fair. Here's the interesting thing about RFK Jr. There's a plurality of support out there for him. I've heard it from people. I've heard people say, yeah, love what he's saying, love the message, could get behind it, all this type of thing. I think Kucinich is onto something. Now, I think the right is probably like, yeah, anything that's gonna, help kind of break things through and, let's Ross Perot this whole situation. Yeah. But I also think there is that alt middle, as I've called it, as other people have called it, I didn't coin that term, of people who weren't happy about what happened with the vaccines, who didn't like vaccine mandates, and who didn't like vaccine cards and all this type of thing. There is, that's a whole, there's people out there who are not happy with that. There are people out there who are looking for an alternative that is sane, conservative, but not Trump. People who are not happy with the trans thing, but that's not Trump. I think there's that group of voters out there exists, and the two major parties have become so polarized, they're very poorly represented. And I think if RFK can sort of be the vanguard leader of the, hey, do you, not mind trans people but don't want it coming after your kids, vote for me. If you think the COVID vaccines were a mistake, vote for me. All this type of, I think there's a voter that exists that's really into him, and I think if he can continue to get more attention and garner more support, I think there's a real possibility that it becomes a thing. I doubt the DNC will allow it, but I would love to see a debate between him and Biden. I think that would be interesting for sure. So we'll be keeping an eye on RFK Jr., and we'll see what comes of him and his whole campaign and situation. So that's the top of the hour. We covered some great news stories, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for watching. I love you always. And I'll see you next Monday on the Cameron Journal Newshour. Don't forget to check out this week's interview on the Cameron Journal podcast. Stay safe, stay sane, and we'll see you next week. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.